And I realize we're studying today someone you may have never heard of or have passed over in reading through the Bible, Phoebe. We're looking at Romans 16, and the only two verses in the Word of God about Phoebe are verses 1 and 2 of chapter 16. So there's not a lot of verses about her compared to the woman caught in adultery that we have studied that had 9 verses and quite a dramatic story. But we're able to see some very neat and special things about this lady, kind of like a little cameo portrait, about 50 words that barely got in the scripture. And I will tell you about that. But to see her clearly, we need to see the context of where she lived and when she lived. And that we see some of that context in Romans chapter 15. So if you may need to turn your page back. First of all, the book of Romans, Paul wrote to whom? The church at Rome. It's interesting because Paul had never been there when he wrote this book. But he knew a lot of people in that church. Maybe he sent some of them there to work in that church. And he is pouring out his heart to them. Look in chapter 15, verse 23. It says there that Paul spent his whole ministry wanting to get to Rome and never being able to get there until the very end. That was Paul's way of operation. He would go in a country or a province and go to the largest city or the capital city first and start there. And so he certainly wanted to go to the capital of the empire. And verse 24, he tells them, I'm going to make a trip to Spain. And when I do that, I'll come through Rome to go to Spain. But verse 25 and 26, he says, I have to go to Jerusalem first because I have a love offering for the saints that are suffering because of the famine. So he's got to go the opposite direction from Rome and from Spain. And he asks them to pray for him. Look down in verse 30. In fact, he says, I beg you, brothers, for the Lord Jesus Christ's sake and for the love of the Spirit, strive together with me in your prayers to God for me, that I can be delivered from them that do not believe in Judea, and that my ministry that's on my mind for Jerusalem may be accepted of the saints. But if you're a student of the Word, or you in the ladies' class that studied Acts recently, you know that when he got there, the Jewish leaders stirred up the people, they beat him, they arrested him, and he spent the rest of his life as a prisoner of Rome. So he knew what he was facing, what he went. And then if you look down to verse 33 in chapter 15, that sounds like the end. Because that's how Paul ended all of his books, with a wonderful sign-off, some kind of blessing. His sign-off there is, may the God of peace be with you all. Isn't that sweet? This sparked my curiosity, and I thought, I want to see how Paul signed all his letters. And so I went from Romans, I even included Hebrews in this list. And every book, either the last verse or almost the last verse, has a blessing. The God of peace be with you. The God of grace be with you. The fellowship of the Spirit be with you. The God of glory be with you. It's wonderful. I recommend you doing that as a devotion someday. Just see how God wants to bless us. And Paul wanted to bless these people with this. That's so much a better sign-off than sincerely or yours truly. It's a wonderful blessing. So if you look at chapter 15, before we get to 16, you see that looks like a sign-off in verse 33. But he's not through. We know that Paul dictated the book of Romans, because in chapter 16, verse 22, the poor guy who wrote it, it's a long book, Tertius, he said, greetings from Tertius who wrote this. Didn't mean he authored it, but he was the stenographer for Paul. And Tertius means third, and we think he was a slave because often slaves, when they had children, named their children first, second, third. Maybe Mama called them something different, but that's how they were known. I bet he was doing his hand like this. You remember back in the old days when we had to write papers for school with our hands? And that was so hard. I think he was shaking his hand when Paul got to that verse and thinking, finally, the end. Oh no, he's got more. So he goes on into chapter 16, and he has greetings for 35 people by name that he knew in the Church of Rome. That's amazing, isn't it? He'd never been there. And yet he knew who was there. But I will tell you, chapter 16 is rather like reading the phone book. Name after name after name after name. Many of them we never hear about. But the good news for us is that he started the chapter with 2 verses about Phoebe. And we'll look at those in just a minute. I was surprised in study to learn that archaeologists found a rubbish pile in Egypt of documents, and the weather and the sands had preserved them. And this is the form of a business letter. When someone had a business in another town, they would write about instructions, and they would send greetings to the people in their business in that town. And they found many of them preserved, but all the names are men that are greeted. There's something very unusual about Paul's list. There are 8 women in it. Ladies, that is unheard of. So you tell that to anybody who feels like they're a Paul hater, that he didn't like women or didn't want them in ministry. And 5 of the women are singled out with descriptors. And I knew you would ask me and I would not be able to remember, so I put them on your sheet. In verse 3, another one is Priscilla. You remember her husband's name? Aquila, right? The couple. Look at verse 4. Paul said, what had they done for him? Laid down themselves or laid down their necks is what the... Now that's quite a friend, isn't it? No wonder Priscilla is worthy of respect. It's what the King James says of her. And apparently they also have a church meeting in their home. So Paul greets Priscilla. And the next one he greets is in verse 6. And I knew that you would know this person was a woman because we know that name. Mary. I don't know which Mary. What does he tell us about Mary in verse 6? She worked very hard. That's a very good commendation, isn't it? Now the next women named, and I had to have somebody tell me who were the women, are in verse 12. Tryphenia and Tryphosa. Don't you just know those are twins? That name means dainty. Because their names mean dainty, they might have been twins who were born into a wealthy family to have names like that. And then another woman is mentioned in that verse, and that's Persis. And that name means in the language, she who takes situations by storm. Do you know anybody named Persis who grabs every circumstance by storm? And well, what does Paul say about her? She labored much. Tryphenia and Tryphosa labored in the Lord. I'm glad for the little dainty ladies that they did labor. But Persia, she seized every opportunity. And then there's another woman who is not named in verse 13. Paul references the mother of Rufus. And she was so special to Paul that he called her his mother. You know, when you think of Paul, you don't think of somebody who needs a mother. He was so strong and powerful. But he did. And he found in this older woman a mother. And then two more that we don't have any details about. Julia. Julia means curly hair. It's taken from the name Julius. If you've ever seen an inscription, a picture of Julius Caesar, he had curly hair. That's what it means for him. And the sister of Nereus, who is not named. Nereus is the name of a Roman god of the sea, Neptune, under Neptune. So because of their names, I wonder if they were from Caesar's family or Caesar's household. Because the end of that verse says the saints with them, like a church met in their house. But there are other places in the gospel where Paul greets those believers of Caesar's household. And so I wonder if this is who that was. Now, why did God put all these names of people that aren't anywhere else in the Bible? All Scripture is profitable for doctrine or reproof or correction or instruction. Why did God put the names of these individuals that we know nothing else about? One small reason is that there are more people laboring in the church beside the pastor or the elders. Your name in any book that God has? The book of life. I hope your name is there. I wonder if in that book it has any descriptor. Here's a name. Does it say she labored much? Here's a name. Does it say she just got in under the wire? Are you dear, like Rufus's mother was? Another name, she came if it was convenient. Another name, she could be counted on. She seized every opportunity, like that one. And I think this is interesting because down to verse 17 of Romans 16, Paul begins to mention some people who were problems in the church. Now, he does not name them. What is the problem with these people? False teaching. But even up above that, what is the problem? Divisions and dissension. Problems in the church. I think women are uniquely gifted to contribute to such because we are verbal and we like to give our opinions. Paul did name two women who disagreed in the church in the book of Philippians. So maybe those are some of the descriptors. I hope not. Well, if there were problem people, Phoebe was not a problem people. She was a pillar people, a pillar of the church. She did not cause people to stumble. So with all this background, we will look at Phoebe. And I have an interesting analogy as we go back to the first verse of chapter 16. I was helped by the longtime livers in Gallatin this morning, helped me recall something. Maybe 40 or 45 years ago, there was a mayor of Gallatin named Don Wright, and he was a writer of historical novels, and he was an artist. He did illustrations for his books, and he had a wonderful old vintage, probably first house in Tennessee kind of thing, home that he lived in here in Gallatin. And I went once on a tour of homes back when we first moved here. And in his bedroom, over the beautiful fireplace, there was a gorgeous painting of a woman. She was in a beautiful gown. It looked like maybe antebellum times or older even times. And she had beautiful hair and a beautiful figure, and she looked so dainty in her environment. But for her face, there was no face. And Don Wright was not married. And the tour guide said he plans to fill in the face when he finds the woman. which I'm sure excited much excitement among the eligible women in Gallatin, because he was kind of a mover and shaker kind of person. I think he did eventually fill it in. I think I may have met her.
I've met her. She's very pretty.
She's very pretty, and she is
And dainty.
and dainty. And I think she's in the DAR. I think I met her the time I visited there, and I was thinking, well, your face got there. That's amazing. So I want us, with these two verses, to fill in a face for Phoebe. Let's see what we can find out about her. First of all, her name means bright or radiant. It's actually a pagan name. It was for a moon goddess. And sometimes the masculine form of it described Apollos, big gods. So this tells us something about Phoebe. She probably was not born a Jew. She was probably born a Greek and lived as a Gentile before Paul. But Paul says, I commend to you, commend. The lady committed and found caught in adultery, worried about being condemned last week. This lady is commended, which is like a letter of introduction of saying this person is not a pretender. She's not a fraud. She is genuine. It's a good thing. It's kind of what someone does when you put their name down for a reference on an application. You hope they're able to commend you. And Paul commended a lot of people in his letters, though he didn't often use the word commend. He said, I'm sending this by so-and-so, receive him and help him along the way. And although he did commend many people, Phoebe is the only one that he wrote about a commendation that's 2 verses long. Already she's interesting. And what is the other word in that first phrase he uses to describe her? Our sister. How many of you have sisters? Well, all of you have spiritual sisters. How do you have spiritual sisters? Through Christ. They're people who have God as their father. And then you have that relationship as sisters. So that's a pretty significant word. She's bright and radiant. Paul can commend her. And she is a sister. God made this real to me before I even studied this lesson when our dear friends from India were here a few weeks ago. After they left our church, they went to a church in East Tennessee. And Bobby asked James to please go with them there. Now, Bobby and his wife knew the pastor of that church and had been in their church at another place many years ago. And wicked me, I said to James, I knew he was tired. I said, do you have to do that? That's a Wednesday night, and I don't want you to drive back after that. And he said, I do. He said, Bobby wants me to go because he said, if someone commends me to the church, they will have much more acceptance of me. And you can say, I've known this man for about 45 years. I know his ministry. I know he's legitimate. Because there are people that go around to churches for aid that are not legitimate. And James found out a good way to weed them out. He says, tell me where you went to church in this other town you came from. And what is the pastor's name? All right, I'm going to call him. At which point many get up and leave. Because there is no commendation. I can understand in Bible times, how would you know who this person that shows up is? How would you know if what they're bringing you is legitimate from anybody? You do need someone to commend you to go. Now, she's starting out good, but she gets better. What does it say about her? Karen, you mentioned it. She's a servant of the church at Synchrea. I want you to look on the back of your sheet. There's a little map. And where this is taking place is in the bottom of Greece, over on the right-hand side. You see Corinth and Centuria, and the two dots are almost right together on your map. Corinth was a very large city, and we know Paul wrote letters to the Corinthians. He stayed there a long time, establishing that church. And Cenchrea was the port for Corinth, and it was about 6 miles away, but it was right on the ocean. Let's think about being a servant. First of all, I want to say that Paul really understood what service was, didn't he? Did he serve when it was easy? Did he serve when it was hard? Did he serve when it meant his life? Yeah. All right. He's talking about something he understands. Now, the Greek word here is diakonos, from which we get the word translated deacon. And so modern women's eyes light up. Phoebe was a deacon, a deaconess. And that's exactly what Paul said. She was a servant of the church. The word is used 12 times in the New Testament, and 5 times it talks about servants in the church. The other times are for men who were servants in the church. Now, in Timothy, where it describes qualifications for deacons, the King James uses the phrase, the office of a deacon. So, is being a deacon an office, or is it serving? It's interesting to me, that passage in Timothy where twice it talks about the office of a deacon. It uses the exact same word. It's the serving of a servant. Now, there is a phrase in that same book where Paul describes the office of a bishop, and that's a different word. It's a word for oversight or superintendent, maybe would be an English equivalent. Why do women want to be deacons? Often it's because they want an office and authority, which I will just tell you, in church history, deacons never were an office until the last 150, 200 years. They were always servants, which is the biblical meaning. I have observed in my long life in the South, sometimes there are problems with deacons who want to be officers or even authorities. And I laughingly think it is no wonder that the Baptist school in North Carolina, Wake Forest, their football team is the Demon Deacons. Because I have seen some deacons that acted like that. I've seen some that were servants. And I've seen some that attacked everyone that did not agree with them until they got rid of them. It's kind of traditional. No, it's not here, but I will tell you, when the church was first confronted with what the Bible says about deacons, there was a fight. So I just want you to know that. The office of a deacon means the servanthood of a servant, the serving of a servant. And this is what Phoebe was. Well, I respect her even more. She was a servant, and Cenchrea is a tiny little place compared to Corinth, but they were both wicked places. Corinth had a temple to Apollos that had over 1,000 prostitutes in it. And there were 100 idolatrous temples in Corinth. But there were also idolatrous temples in that little town that was the port. So here she is, a Greek woman with an idolatrous name, and idolatry is rampant in her culture, and she has somehow come to Christ. I just want to say, wow. And she is in this little church in this port city. I've been reading an interesting book called Rediscover Church. And it makes an analogy I had never thought of. A church in any place is like an embassy from a foreign government. We have United States embassies in many foreign countries, and they represent our interest and our laws. They are headed by an ambassador in the U.S. who appoints him. President. In other countries, a king appoints the ambassador. And they speak the language of their country, even in a foreign land. They abide by the laws of their foreign land. Isn't a church like that? Aren't we living in a foreign land? Shouldn't we always speak the language of our king? Shouldn't we always follow his laws? Shouldn't we thank God for whatever leadership he's put there? I will tell you, if you've ever traveled, someone said, who was in the service of our country, you be sure you know where the American embassy is. Because you may need them, and you may need them quick. And in truth, that's why we need a church. We need each other. We need people who will encourage us to do right, who have enough love for us to say, I think I see you doing something you shouldn't. You know, that's hard. But we need that. Well, I hope that this little embassy can show Gallatin what the service of our King is really like. That depends on y'all. Now, what does this have to do with Phoebe? I noticed studying, maybe 75% of the writers I read about this passage said Phoebe carried the book of Romans to the church in Rome. But this is the only place that talks about her. And I thought, where are these people getting this? Her name is not mentioned anywhere else in the Bible. And finally, somebody who said that said many ancient manuscripts of Romans have this at the end. Written to the Romans from Corinth, sent by Phoebe, servant of the church at Cenchrea. Now, I didn't find that in any of the translations that I had at home, but I did find her name again in the Strong's Concordance, and it says postscript. It's not in a reference. So that is written to the Romans from Corinth, 6 miles down the road, sent by Phoebe. Do you realize Paul wrote this, spent all these hours, his scribe has a broken hand. How are they going to get it there? Can they seal it and put a stamp on it and put it in the mail? Can they send him an email? Can they save it in Word documents? How are you going to get it there? Somebody has to carry it. Now, were Christians welcomed in the Roman Empire?
No.
Well, that might have been a dangerous job. And maybe that's one reason Phoebe took it. She would not attract attention like a man carrying something might. This is a long journey. From here, there's a little isthmus that connects the part where Athens is to this part, which is the very bottom of Greece here. And it's about 6 miles long, and she might have walked across that and caught another boat and then gone out into the Ionian Sea, and little bit of sea between the toe of the boot of Italy, and then gotten up there to Rome. Or she may have walked across, or she may have even walked up here, because look, that's the only other port city that's on that side that was there in this time. And ships hated to sail around here because there were so many shipwrecks. So however she went, it was a long journey, wasn't it? And no husband is mentioned, no children are mentioned, no other people from the church are mentioned. She apparently went by herself carrying the book of Romans. Where would we be without Romans? Finally, Paul has made what is called the greatest theological treatise of Christians. He takes the truth of the Old Testament that we are sinners and hopelessly alienated from God apart from a sacrifice that bridges that gap, and that Christ's death is the only thing that bridges that gap. And Romans does teach. Maybe you have witnessed to somebody and used the Roman road. We'll talk about being a sinner. We'll talk about what Christ did. We'll talk about repenting and believing. It's excellent. It's the book that Martin Luther was saved by reading. We celebrated Reformation Sunday last month. There would be no Reformation without Romans. John Wesley was how he got saved, reading Romans. After many years as a pastor, he got saved. Many people, this is a one, would you trust that to a girl? Now, I don't know what age she was. I feel like she was older because no children are mentioned or no husband is mentioned. She could have been a single person all of her life. But she is making this trip, and I wonder if she had that parchment rolled up in the folds of her dress. So this lady they have never seen shows up, and how did she ever find any believers without GPS addresses? Where believers were kind of secret. And here she is. Do you see why she needed that commendation from Paul at this point? So he says to you receive this lady. You deliberately take her in as becomes saints. The King James says becomes, I believe. What do some other translations? Receive her as something saints. As being worthy. The Greek word is a word for the balance scales. Christ on this side, Phoebe on this side, and they are equal. And ladies, that should be what people see when they look at us. Oh, she's like Christ. I see Christ in her. Receive her as become saints, holy, separate from the world, separate from sin. Now, any saints in this room? Well, there are as many saints as there are women. Yes, Barbara, I'm glad you know you're a saint. Does that mean perfect? No. Do you realize that word is used 49 times in the New Testament to just apply to average, everyday believers? It's a wonderful word. And I think when they looked at this woman and they read that commendation, she might have had to say, let me roll it backwards so you can see here at the end. That's where the commendation is. And when they read that, they said, honey, come sit on the front row. We are glad to see you. We will take this book. And she was one with them, and they received her in. Isn't that a beautiful picture? I remember James when he went to Spain and when he went to India, all those times, he said he felt like an alien because nothing he saw or heard or smelled or tasted was like anything he had ever had before. He said it was the most alone feeling, except when he went to a church and they took communion, they took the Lord's Supper. He said, I couldn't understand what they were saying, but I could see their faces. And it was like, oh, finally, home. Home. It was wonderful. You know, in this day, different parts of the world were not only prejudiced against people that weren't in their group, but they were actively hostile to people that weren't in the group. And if you're a student of the New Testament, you know the Jews were fighting each other a lot of times. So here's a letter from Paul, the Jew of all Jews, taken by a woman who was a Greek, a Gentile, originally, to Roman readers of this letter, maybe even people in Caesar's household. Now, what binds all those together? Not the empire, That was just their common chain, faith. And he says to her, whatever she needs, you assist her. And that's an interesting word that's used only here in the New Testament. It means not only to help, it means to scrutinize. I'm going to tell you to look at her. You need to learn from her. You look very carefully at her. She is one to be trusted, and whatever she needs, you do. I wonder if one of those things was, Paul said, would y'all please make 2 copies of this book? And let's send one back over to Greece and one back over to the Turkey part where he had started churches. I don't know. I don't know what she needed. I don't know if Paul knew her and knew he could trust her and he sent her, or if she knew Paul was writing this letter to the Romans and would need to get it there. And she said, Paul, I've got to go to Rome. I'll take it. I don't know if Paul asked her to go because she was wealthy and could afford it. That's something thought from that last thing. It says she was a succour, which is not a word we use in sentences very often. Does anybody have another translation? She has been a succour of many. Great help. That's good. Provider. Furnisher. I think like we have an example in here today. Ree is a succour of that baby she's holding. She provides whatever that baby needs. And she protects that baby. And that baby is her great interest. It's also a word that is translated in secular things as a patron. Have you ever heard of some rich lady that's a patron of the arts? And back in the Middle Ages, all those starving artists and composers had to have somebody that paid their bills. And then they could do this marvelous work. And that's what he's saying. She functions in such a way as to allow other people to work. Because he stayed 1.5 years in that city trying to help those people understand what it meant to be a Christian. They were so pagan. That's the context of that passage where Paul says, some of you used to be adulterers and thieves and cheaters and homosexuals and partiers. That's all behind you. You've got to learn to be different. This is what it means to follow Christ. This was so foreign. Well, Paul closes the book of Colossians by saying to a specific man, take heed to the ministry which you've received in the Lord and do it. So that makes me think that all of us have a ministry outlined. And our responsibility is to do it. And so in the book of life, what's going to be by your name? What descriptor will fit by your name in the book of life? God gave us a few descriptors in chapter 16. He certainly has a descriptor for all of us. You know, the lady last week, the lady caught in adultery, we remembered Hawthorne's book, The Scarlet Letter. She had to wear an A. And everybody who saw it knew that meant she was an adulteress. Well, Phoebe could have worn the scarlet letter S, servant. Not only was Phoebe a servant who helped people, she was a bright, radiant servant. She didn't begrudge it.